You see him? Clancy asked Roger. The two of them crouched behind the fence. Shut up, or he's going to hear us, Roger hissed, pressing his eye to the splintery wood. It was after sunset, and if their mothers realized they weren't home yet, the boys would be in big trouble. They didn't care, though. They wanted to look at this mysterious fella who lived in the creepy old house at the end of the block. The one who only came out after dark. Thomas Donahue was known to almost everyone in Chambliss. It was a small town, a town built on coal and lumber, and the population was roughly 20,000. As such, the large and foreboding house at the end of Fortner Lane stood out like a sore thumb. In a town of mostly trailers and ranch homes, the house in question was Donahue Place, and it loomed like a gargoyle at the end of the cul-de-sac. No one knew how long it had been there, but some of the kids had seen a picture of the old manor in old paintings from the early days of the town. They say it had been occupied by the town's founder, and when he'd been arrested after a string of children had gone missing, someone new had taken up residence there. Someone who only came out after dark. The mob hadn't waited for justice to be served, it was said. They had dragged Thomas from his cell and beheaded him in the street, something that was the custom in certain places. Afterwards, the townspeople had wanted to go and see what sort of things the town founder had in his now empty home. But when the lights kept coming on and strange figures were seen around the grounds, they thought the magnificent manor might be haunted. They assumed it would eventually fall to pieces without someone to take care of it, but instead, the house remained, and even seemed to thrive under the care of whoever owned it. People had seen a shadowy figure making changes to the home for years, maintaining the grounds and fixing the damage to the ancient three-story, but no one had ever met him. That was 100 years ago, and as the town grew, the house remained as a mystery within Chambliss. No one in town still believed the house was haunted, but they knew someone was living there. Whoever they were extremely reclusive. When people came to the house, no one ever answered the door. If you approached the person while they were in the yard, they would always retreat inside. No one knew who they were or what relation they might be to the old founder. But they did know one thing about the owner of the house, and that was that he loved Halloween. The owner of the house may not be social the other 364 days of the year, but on Halloween, they threw the gates open and passed out the choicest candies and the best tricks. As the boys watched, the yard was already being prepared for the coming holiday. The front porch was festooned with pumpkins. The yard was set with gravestones and half-buried caskets, and the cobwebs and bats were thick in every tree. The trees in the yard always looked skeletal, despite how much attention was paid to the lawn, and they added to the aesthetic of the home. No one could be sure, but everyone was pretty sure the creepy nature of the homestead was intentional. The wood was dark, painted a deep brown, and stained like dark chocolate. The windows always glowed with something like candlelight, and the house just seemed to lean malevolently. Beyond those gates, it was Halloween every day for whoever happened to live there. "What's he doing?" Clancy asked. The crack he was peeking through wasn't very wide, and Roger had the better vantage point with the knothole. "He's filling orange bags with leaves for yard jack-o'-lanterns." "How does he see?" Clancy asked, the scritch-scratch of the man's rake constant as he collected up his medium. "Dunno. He doesn't even have the porch light on. Maybe he's raking by pumpkin light." Clancy wanted to look up over the fence, but he didn't dare. Both boys assumed the man would just leave if he thought they were watching, but you could never be sure. When Clancy's mother called his name, the boys stiffened like a goose had walked over their graves. They could see the person in the yard stiffen too, looking in the direction of the call as he turned to the fence. In the gathering shadows, they could see that he was dressed in jeans and a sweater, clothes that would look as acceptable for yard work as they would for a homeless man. The garments hung off of him, his body thin and emaciated, and people in town thought he might be sick. His voice, however, did not match his appearance. The voice everyone heard when they did business with him was rich, cultured, and full of vigor. Many of the women secretly held affection for him, saying his voice sounded like one of the men from the romance novel covers they all read, while their husbands were at work, of course. They would have to imagine what his face might look like, though, because he never came into town. He would call the local businesses and tell them he needed supplies delivered to the house about twice a year. Wood, decorations, candy, various and sundry things that he used to fix up the house or to get ready for the holidays. He never called the grocer or the butcher, however, and people weren't sure what he was eating up there. Whatever it was, it kept him going, and he continued to tirelessly work on the house and the grounds by moonlight. "Roger!" came the shrill cry from farther down the block. "Roger, it's past curfew, boy. You'd better get home before your dinner gets cold." "Crap," Roger said, taking his eyes off the yard as he turned back towards the house. "She sounds mad." "We better go," Clancy whispered, feeling very exposed by the pool of illumination from the streetlight overhead. "Yeah, might be a..." "Are you boys quite all right?" said a cultured voice from behind them. Both boys jumped like someone had lashed them with a belt. They looked back, shaking as the shadow of the stranger fell across them. In the gloom of the yard, he had appeared to be a large, thin man, but now he loomed over the boys like a giant from a fable. Both had barely gotten a good look at the stranger before the lamp overhead popped and left them standing in the gathering darkness. Both yelled in terror, scrambling away from the fence as they beat feet up the street for home, as startled by the lamp as the man. He watched them go, his face obscured by the gloom, except for his eyes. Both boys would swear later that they had seen 2 red flickers where his eyes should be. Both boys would also swear that his head had been a grinning skull until the day they died. "It was probably just a mask, Roger," Clancy said as they walked to school the next day. He could still feel the sting his dad had put into his bottom for being out past dark, and his mother had scolded him for bothering the nice man who lived at Donahue Place. "He's never hurt anyone, and he'll never feel like he can introduce himself to the neighborhood if you kids keep bothering him." She had colored a little as she said it, and some of the snap in his father's hand could have been because he'd noticed. Many of the men in town were hoping that the mysterious man would stay in his house and leave their wives to their daydreams. "Mask nothing," Roger said. "That was a skull with 2 red eyes. You and I both saw it." "I don't know," Clancy hedged, not wanting another whipping from his dad for bothering people. His dad had been passed up for another promotion at the paper mill, and he was ornery these days. His mom had tried to console him, saying he'd get it next time, but he'd been sitting in the den with a case of beer in a foul mood lately. "What I know is that someone with a skeleton for a head is living in our town, and we should let people know about it." "Yeah?" Clancy said skeptically. "How are we going to do that? Mr. Donahue never comes out or lets people see him, so how are we going to do anything?" "Just so happens we all need him to come out. In 2 nights, Mr. Donahue will open his gates and let kids in to trick-or-treat. He always has a spooky display where he hides so he can give people a good scare. If we can get close, we can snap a picture and get proof. You still got that instant camera?" Clancy nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, but if I break it running away, my mom will literally kill me. It was a Christmas present." "We won't break it," Roger assured him. "Once we get proof, we'll be heroes. Imagine how cool we'll be if we snap a picture of the ghost that haunts Donahue Place." Clancy thought about it, and as he thought of the kids at school chanting his name, he decided that it might be worth the risk. He and Roger would be legends, and a reputation like that could take them all the way to middle school. "What's your costume this year?" Roger asked, though it sounded like it didn't matter. "I got a cardboard box robot that I made last year," Clancy said. His dad had helped him make it last year, back when he was in a better mood, and Clancy had added a little more spray paint the following week. That had earned him a loud scolding from his dad, too. Apparently, he had used the good spray paint and not the cheap crap that he had bought for him last year. Clancy had said he was sorry and finished up with the other can. It looked good now, and the thought that he might not wear it made him feel a little sad. It would surely be too small next year. I got another ninja costume from my grandma. She gave it to me for my birthday last year. Mom bought me a new one without thinking about it, and if we go as ninjas, we can make a hasty retreat once we get the picture. The logic was sound to Clancy. Ninjas would be faster than a clunky box robot, and he agreed to meet at Roger's house on Friday night. Bring your camera, and don't be late. I want to hit a few houses before we get to the big prize. It was edging up on 9 o'clock when the boys got to the gates of the Donahue place. A few houses had turned into a 3-hour tour of 6 different neighborhoods, and when Roger realized what time it was, he'd said a word that would have made Clancy's mom wash his mouth out with soap. The boys had run back to their neighborhood and left their candy at Roger's house before heading out again. Roger's mom had asked if they didn't have enough candy, but Roger said they had one more house to hit before they packed it in. We got to get candy from the Donahue place. He always has the best treats in town. She had told them to be quick, and the 2 ninjas had headed back into the night. Now that they were standing here before the lair of the beast, Clancy was feeling a little unsure of the plan. Let's just go back, Roger. We've got enough candy. We don't really need to. But Roger stepped into the yard like he hadn't even heard him. Roger intended to get his treat this year. Clancy was left with no choice but to turn around or follow after, and his loyalty to his friend was too great to back out now. The yard was set up like a graveyard, and as they walked towards the house, Clancy jumped as a zombie lurched out of a coffin that had been set up next to the gate. He growled and roared before descending back down again to get ready for the next victim. Roger laughed as the kid in the ghost costume jumped in time with Clancy, glancing around to make sure that he was the last before proceeding. It was late now, and the boys were the last 2 left on the property. If they were going to make their move, now would be the time. They made their way up the sidewalk, graves erupting to reveal zombies or skeletons that popped out with a mechanical growling noise. He was really going all out this year, it seemed, and the boys expected a grave to contain the mysterious Mr. Donahue at any minute. He would come stomping out, dressed as a skeleton or a zombie, and they could trick him into bending down so they could snatch his mask and reveal his face. Clancy was ready with his camera, and Roger had seen him snap several panic shots as they went. The closer they got to the house without encountering him, the more their nerves jangled. With every crackly mechanical growl and yowl that split the air, the boys' trepidation rose, and as they mounted the stairs to the house, they felt a cold chill run up their backs. They had come midway when the door to the house opened, revealing a rocking chair with a headless body seated in it. It held a bucket of candy in its lap, the chair creaking menacingly with every sway of the occupant. "Get the camera ready," Roger whispered, sneaking up to the chair. Clancy nodded, standing just inside the door as he tried to stop his knees from shaking. Roger came up to the bowl, his eyes boring into the headless thing as he reached into the mound of candy. He expected the jump, expected the scare, but he never expected the direction it might come from. Clancy watched through the little window, hands shaking as he waited to snap the picture. All at once, Roger shot his free hand for where the head should be on the rocker, trying to find its head. Should be right below the neckline, an easy grab, but as Roger patted the spot, he found it solid, crying out in pain as something took hold of his rooting hand. He had been so intent on the shoulders, he hadn't bothered to take his hand out of the candy bowl. Now, something had a hold of it, and Roger was afraid it would tear it off. "Clancy! Clancy, help me!" he yelled, but the door slammed shut then, sealing their fate. As the man stood up, Roger pulled his hand free of the bowl, and Clancy screamed in terror as the bloody skull chomped happily at it. It was an old skull, the bones red with blood, and the teeth were turning red as Roger's fingers were ground beneath them. Roger shook it only once, the pain too great to have it move much, and when the meaty snap washed over the boys, the skull hit the ground with nearly half the finger still in his mouth. Roger fled, pounding on the door as Clancy sputtered and cried for someone to help them. His camera flashed a few more times, but what it caught was anyone's guess. When the body bent down to get the head, tucking it under its arm, the skull seemed to tut as it worried down the finger into its non-existent throat. "Terribly sorry, boys. I know it's bad manners and a touch barbaric, but Bloody Bones here does love his treats on Halloween. I've had to limit him. Missing children do make such a fuss. But," the skull said, as its bones turned up abnormally, "Halloween is such a hectic time. Sometimes children go missing for one reason or another." The boys cowered as he came towards them, but their screams fell on deaf ears as Bloody Bones and Rawhead went about their business. The boys were searched for, but never found. The police came and searched Donahue Place, but they never found the boys or its mysterious owner. Donahue Place continues to stand to this day, and every Halloween there's a grand event with candy and decorations. Supplies are still delivered, the bills are always paid, and children sometimes go missing. No one could know that when the townspeople beheaded Thomas Donahue, they would create a legacy that would outlast even the town. None of them could have known what they created with the swipe of a simple axe, or how it would haunt the town forevermore. Jeffrey hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffrey was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffrey had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffrey had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffrey was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffrey. "What kind of prank?" Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. "Something big, something they'll never forget," Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends, more than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-O-Lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. They'll need to be full face too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy, my bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one, because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "I still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school. Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it," Chris said. "We don't know that," Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. "He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed." Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for this scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffrey could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required 6-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The 3 stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45 they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other 2 could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the 3 of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other 2 and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Bask, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Bask, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the streetlight seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffrey was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffrey nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffrey finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffrey had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffrey's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffrey felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffrey its power. As Jeffrey rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffrey had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffrey was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffrey thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffrey felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffrey expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffrey for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffrey found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffrey saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. but the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and 2 guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Through it all, Jeffrey said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffrey said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffrey refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffrey never saw him again. Jeffrey never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffrey smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffrey had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffrey had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffrey crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those 2 imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffrey slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The Green Man called Jeffrey to action, and who was he to deny him? What in the hell are those? Clarence had gone to Reggie's Veggies to buy seeds, just as he had every year since Reggie had opened. David Decker probably bought his seeds here too, Clarence reflected. It was part of the reason that Clarence kept coming back. The fact that Reggie was a friend since boyhood, and Clarence taking his business to a new feed store up the road would hurt his feelings, was secondary. Clarence wanted to beat David, wanted to beat him so bad he could taste it. David was a bit of a local celebrity, a legend in the agricultural community, and he'd grown the biggest pumpkins in the county for the last 5 years running. For the last 5 years, Clarence had been content with second place, but he felt that this year was different somehow. This was the year that he beat David Decker and took his rightful place as the biggest pumpkin grower in the county. This year was also different because Reggie said he had something special for Clarence. He had what he called a secret weapon, and he assured him that it would finally wipe the smile off old Decker's face. Reggie had no reason to dislike Decker. He's probably one of Reggie's best customers after all. But the old man had been getting cocky lately, and his bravado had turned the humble produce seller's stomach. Clarence picked up the packet and looked at it. It was just a normal pack of seeds, maybe a little old and crumpled, but clearly just seeds. Reggie had found them in a trunk that had belonged to his grandfather, and they had looked eldritch on the semi-modern countertop. The paper had taken on that soft, velvety feel of a material that has seen the fall of the Second World War, and the seeds inside felt like hard little bullets under Clarence's thumb. The paper declared them to be Blutkürbisser, and everything on the package was in a foreign language. He would have sworn it was something that Reggie had bought from a joke shop, if he wasn't so serious. To be sure, Reggie was a practical joker, but his face was stone-cold serious as he looked at him from across the counter of his vegetable stand. "Blood pumpkins," Clarence said skeptically. "Blood pumpkins," Reggie intoned, back with deep seriousness. "I don't know, Reggie. These things look older than God. You sure they'll grow?" "Absolutely." Reggie stretched the word into 3. "Granddad bought 'em back when he was in Germany. He said the pumpkins he saw over there were huge." Clarence scoffed. "Your granddad was a sodbuster, just like mine, Reggie. When did he go to Germany?" "During the war, same as your granddad, except your granddad spent it in Alaska." Clarence wanted to take offense to that, but Reggie was right. Granddad had gotten a very cushy post, while Reggie's granddad had gotten half his leg blown off by a potato masher and was sent home with honors. Reggie's granddad had used the payout from the government to buy the building where the feed store now sat, while Clarence's grandfather had used his payout to buy the land where his farm was. Just because Reggie Sr. had been a drunk who had squandered the family business was no fault of his. "Let me get my usual spread of regular pumpkins too, Reggie, just to be safe. So, how do these work anyway? Any special instructions for these German pumpkins?" Granddad always said that the man who gave him the seeds said that a sacrifice was required to see them reach their full potential. What that sacrifice was, the man wouldn't say. Granddad figured if anyone knew anything about sacrifices, it'd be farmers, like you and me. Reggie wasn't wrong. All farming was one sacrifice after another. Farmers sacrificed their time, their love, their family, their hair, and damn near everything else so they could afford to keep the taxes paid and the lights on year after year. Sod busting was nothing but sacrifice in many ways, and Clarence figured he'd plant the seeds and see what came of them. He honestly figured he'd get more out of the other packs of seeds than these old pumpkin bullets anyway. He would look back on that moment and reflect that he had known nothing of sacrifice. The seeds went into the ground in the east field just like generations of pumpkins had before them. As he stood up and rubbed the dirt from his hands, he looked across the field he had nurtured and felt the same sense of pride he always did. Corn was coming up, potatoes and yams, beans and peanuts. The fruit trees were filling the orchard with their sweet scent, and now the pumpkins would be the crowning jewel of his farm. The July sun beat down on him, and he shaded his eyes as he surveyed his kingdom. Clarence knew it wouldn't be long before harvest time. Soon the fields would be filled with the sounds of picking and packing, and it would be time to take another load down to Reggie's so he could sell his wares. Clarence could lay enough back to make it through the winter, and maybe even a little more for the inevitable repairs to the barn or the house. maybe for some expansion next year when the taxes came in. And, he reflected, once he won this year's grand prize for biggest pumpkin, Clarence could open up his own stall the following spring and sell his own wares, just like his father used to. It was a great plan, and now it was time to see if it could bear fruit. Pumpkins grew pretty quickly, as pumpkins do, but after a month, Clarence had 3 that he believed would be real contenders. He had named them, as he did every year, and the names he had chosen were no less grand than the pumpkins themselves. Hercules, Goliath, and Sampson dwarfed their fellows by quite a bit, and it seemed that they would be the entries this year. Some people thought it was silly to name a pumpkin, but Clarence always named the ones he thought would be entries in the fair. The other 40 or so would be sold to pie makers, pumpkin carvers, and all sorts of other folks, but these 3 would be weighed, judged, and then made into pies by Mrs. Clarence for the pie contest to be held 2 days hence. He always laughed about it, but Clarence always felt a little sorry to see her make those pumpkins into pies after he'd worked so hard raising them. On the other hand, the blood pumpkin had sprouted only a single offering. Clarence had named him Fritz and set him apart from the rest. So far, it was underperforming, and Clarence didn't think it would amount to much. Fritz wasn't even as big as most of his regular pumpkins, but he kept tending it in hopes that maybe Fritz was just a late bloomer. He'd been surprised when he'd gotten a pumpkin at all from the seeds, and Clarence had held out hope that maybe Reggie's granddad was right about those pumpkins that would be bigger than the regular ones. He pruned it and weeded it by hand, just as he did with the other 3, in the hopes that maybe it would grow bigger and he could sell it as an oddity at Reggie's stand. While his other pumpkins were orange, this one was a deeper orange, like a blood orange, and its leaves had a strange wilted look to them. Clarence was certain that it would make someone an extra creepy jack-o'-lantern when Halloween rolled around, but he really didn't have high hopes for the stunted little thing other than that. Then, one morning, after caring for it for the past 4 weeks, Clarence was in for a surprise. A painful surprise. Clarence was out tending to the pumpkins, tracking their growth as he nurtured them. His top 3 were still larger and fuller than the others, and Goliath was quickly showing himself to be the front-runner for this year's contest winner. He was pruning around Fritz, his mind wandering, when the shears caught the edge of his index finger. It wasn't a deep cut, but like any wound, it bled a little bit. Clarence snatched his finger back and put it in his mouth, but not before a few drops of blood splattered on the earth around the pumpkin. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a cut, and he slid the bandana out of his pocket and held it to the wound. He waited for the bleeding to stop and then got back to work. He didn't think anything about it until the next day. When he went to go check on the pumpkins, Clarence noticed something odd had happened. It wasn't substantial. The pumpkin hadn't grown giant overnight, but the blood pumpkin had grown. The day before, it had been no bigger than a craft store decoration, but now it bulged from the ground like a blood-red tumor. Overnight, it had become larger than Sampson, the smallest of his entries for the fair. Clarence scratched his head as he took in the anomaly, getting knee-bound so he could take a better look at Fritz. He had done nothing different besides giving it his blood. Then he remembered what Reggie had said. The plant required a sacrifice. The pumpkin needed something more than water and sunlight to thrive, and Clarence suddenly wondered how big Fritz could get. Wasn't the notion of beating Decker worth a little blood? As though in a daze, Clarence pulled out his buck knife and slid the blade across the meat of his palm. The sting was little more than an afterthought, and as he squeezed his fingers together, he watched a scarlet stream fall onto the soil beneath the pumpkin. The drops splashed onto the vines as well, a single fat drop splattering the body of the gourd, and as it fell, Clarence could swear he heard it growing. It was a soft, whispery sound, like the trees in a light wind, and as the ground drank his blood, it left nothing behind. It grew before his eyes, looking bigger than it had a minute ago. Clarence wrapped the same bandana around his hand and got back to work. The pumpkins required a lot of TLC, but it would all be worth it once he wiped the smile off of David Decker's face. When he returned the next day, Fritz had grown 3 inches overnight. For the next 2 weeks, Clarence made a splash of his blood a regular part of the pumpkin's diet. It was never much, the amount you'd get from a diabetes test, but in 2 weeks, he noticed a change in the size of the blood pumpkin. It grew as big as any of the pumpkins Clarence had planned to enter, overshadowing Goliath by a large margin. By the last week of August, Fritz was the clear entry for the fair this year. The sight of Fritz filled Clarence with pride, but it also made his finger itch. Anyone who cared to look would have seen the bruises on his fingertips and palms. Mrs. Clarence had certainly made a lot of them as she doctored them at the dining room table, but she was the only one so far. The farm had a lot of visitors in the last week of August, to his surprise, and it seemed that someone had seen his blood pumpkin. It was his neighbor first. He could hardly miss a pumpkin that was nearly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. He wondered if he could come and have a look, and Clarence had taken him to the field to see it personally. After that, he was visited every day by curious townfolk wanting to see this miraculous pumpkin. They were never unsupervised, of course. As he spent more and more time with the pumpkin, Clarence was becoming quite protective of it. He began to worry that this was as large as it was going to get, topping out just shy of 5 feet, and he started increasing the amount of blood he gave it. He was back to cutting his palm for the fat red drops he'd gotten before, but even that didn't make it grow. The ground drank, but the whispers never happened. Clarence slept poorly, beginning to neglect his other crops, and Fritz the blood pumpkin became somewhat of an obsession. On the 4th of October, Clarence got the visit he'd been expecting. He called on him early, just a short series of knocks that drug him from the table where he'd been listlessly eating his breakfast. He was dressed in overalls and a blue work shirt, boots with run-down heels after many years of use, and a round-top brown hat that was probably meant to make him look like a cowboy, but just made him look more like a farmer from a John Wayne movie. He hadn't taken the hat off, and just stood grinning on the front porch as though they were the best of friends. "David," Clarence said, hiding his mistrust behind a grin, "what brings you all the way out here this early?" "Well, I'd heard tell that I might have a spot to worry about this year. Seems like you've got a real contender on your hands. Mind if I get a look?" Clarence sniffed, sure that he'd heard all kinds of things. Clarence was sure he'd seen pictures and heard gossip, but in the end, Decker decided that he really wanted to look at this miraculous pumpkin. As sure as Decker was, Clarence was just as sure that he didn't want him to see his blood pumpkin. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was mean-spirited, but he felt like it might be something else. Clarence was pretty sure that the pumpkin didn't want Decker to see it. "Sorry, David, you want to see my pumpkin, you'll have to wait till the contest." Clarence swung the door closed, the conversation at an end, just like the pleasantries, and found the tip of one of those run-down boots blocking the way. "Come on now, just a peek. Hell, you let half the town see it, so what's the harm in letting me have a gander?" "I said no, David," Clarence said, his voice a little harder than he strictly meant it to be. "You can see it in 3 weeks, when it's got a blue ribbon attached to it." He moved his foot then, allowing Clarence to close the door, but when he nodded his head and showed him a big grin, Clarence knew it wasn't a genuine smile like he'd seen before. "Suit yourself, then. I'm sure I'll see it in due time." He was right, of course, but seeing would prove to be Decker's undoing. He got his look 3 nights later. Clarence stiffened when he heard the sound of someone cursing softly. He was in bed, his wife snoring peacefully beside him. He had been unable to sleep, his eyes making a map of the dark topography of the ceiling, when he heard the noise from the yard. It could have been the wind, but he knew it wasn't. Clarence felt himself getting out of bed and walking down the hall as he made his way into the kitchen. He moved around the dark table and stood in the screen door as he gazed at the shadowy east field. It was late, midnight by the clock on the stove, and there would have been no way for Clarence to see anyone in the field at all. Standing in the dark kitchen, though, he became very sure that he could see someone walking into the field, carrying something with a long handle. Clarence sleepwalked from the house, silent as a ghost, and though the October wind sent goosebumps up his bare arms, he hardly noticed. As he passed by the woodpile, his hands clambered out to wrap around the old, splintery axe that sat beside the ancient stump. As he approached, Clarence saw the person staring at the pumpkin, staring at Fritz, and in the moonlight, it was easy to see them transfixed by the silhouette of that swollen gourd. They stood stock still, contemplating the next thing they meant to do, and Clarence was less than 30 feet away when they raised the tool and swung it down into the pumpkin with a wet, meaty thunk. Clarence screamed in anguish as he ran, bare feet slapping the earth as he churned up the ground. The person must have heard him because they turned mid-swing. In the moonlight, Clarence failed to register the round-crowned hat and the face full of white, snarling teeth. In his rage, it didn't matter who it was. He had hurt his pumpkin, and now he would end him. He buried the axe in their chest, blade biting into the wood of the hoe, which they had tried to block the swing with, and as the wood splintered, he saw the blood splash across his undershirt. David Decker looked at him with stunned and unbelieving eyes, but those eyes didn't fill with fear until something wrapped around his ankle. His blood had fallen on the ground between them, and even now, the earth was drinking it greedily. He turned drunkenly, axe still buried in his chest, and as he did, he fell to the ground as the blood began to bubble from his lips. The red fell on the face of that unholy gourd, and Clarence saw it grow and writhe before his very eyes. Its vines twined around him, long stalks wrapping him like the coils of a monstrous snake, and all at once, the earth began to writhe and churn as its roots came up to join its tendrils. In his terror, David struggled. His hands lashed out feebly with the broken hoe as he was dragged beneath the soil. Clarence watched as he disappeared into the earth and seemed to come back to himself as his rival disappeared. He felt his knees unhinge all at once and was knee-bound on the soil. As the roots began to slide over him as well, his mind just slipped away as the shadow of the blood pumpkin fell across him, now 6 or 7 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet wide. He could hear it growing and groaning. It grew with a sound like a thin tree in a high wind, and as Clarence blacked out, he never expected to have another thought on God's green earth besides that last. He thought that maybe he had finally made his sacrifice, and that this pumpkin would take him into the earth as its next meal. It might have been kinder if it had. Clarence woke up in the field with his wife standing over him. The pumpkin, that 7-foot-tall behemoth of orange skin and green vines, towered over them both. His shirt was clean, the ground undisturbed, and all signs pointed to the night's events being just a dream, except for the broken hoe and the ugly little scar on the left side of Fritz where the hoe had bitten into him. David Decker was never seen again. The sheriff found his truck not far from the farm, and he came by one afternoon to ask Clarence some questions. The old sheriff sat at the table as his wife sat out lunch, tipping his cigarette ash into a saucer as Mrs. Clarence shot him dark looks for stinking up her kitchen. He asked all the expected questions. Had they seen him? Had he been here? And did Clarence know anything about his disappearance? Clarence told him no. He told him that he had seen David yesterday, but he had left and gone wherever it was he had returned to. Clarence couldn't very well tell him that one of the pumpkins had eaten Decker up and stay out of the nut house. Sheriff made some notes, but ultimately dumped his ash into the garbage can and took his leave. He said the visit was just a courtesy anyway, and that they wouldn't keep Clarence from his harvest. The harvest that year was tremendous. The blood pumpkin wasn't the only thing that had benefited from David's sacrifice, and the yield that year was so great that Clarence could have bought his own stand without the money from winning the contest. That hardly mattered to him, though. Nothing really mattered at that point. By that time, Clarence didn't care about anything but the pumpkin and keeping it happy. October 15th, 5 days before the contest, he began to notice a change in Fritz. Though still connected to the ground and still 7 feet tall, it was beginning to take on a definite sag. It was waxy looking, possessed of an over-ripeness, and Clarence had serious doubts that it would make it to the fair. The blood would no longer sustain it, and whatever it had gotten from David was gone now. It appeared another sacrifice was required, but Clarence didn't have the strength to catch its food for it. The pumpkin was his obsession, but he just didn't have the resolve to feed his neighbors to it. He was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, trying to figure out what to do, when Providence provided. Though unwilling to lure victims for his monstrous gourd, he couldn't stand the idea that it would be lost so soon. To have come so far and stumbled at the finish line was unthinkable, but to give the pumpkin the sacrifice it desired was equally as barbaric. Clarence had no clue what to do, and even from here, he could see the pumpkin waning. It had grown so large that he could see it from almost any place that overlooked the backyard, and the sight of it was awe-inspiring. Had there ever been such a pumpkin as this? Had anyone ever grown a pumpkin so grand? And now, he was just going to let it die. He was weighing his options when the knock came at the door. Clarence shuffled numbly to the door, and to his surprise, he found Reggie standing on the front porch, wiping sweat from his brow and smiling hugely. Reggie, the only one left in town who hadn't come to see the pumpkin. "Thought it was time that I came for a look. They say in town that this pumpkin's something to see." Clarence nodded, a wad of cotton resting in his throat, as an opportunity presented itself before his very eyes. His wife was out visiting a sick friend. The usual crowds had dissipated for now, and this was the first day in weeks he hadn't had to play tour guide. It was just Reggie and Clarence, and he wanted to see the pumpkin, the one he'd heard so much about around the stand. Reggie had walked from his farm a few blocks away. He'd probably told no one where he was going. Clarence offered him a glass of tea as he walked through the kitchen, and then he took him to the east field so he could marvel at the pumpkin. As he gawped in disbelief, Clarence slipped his hand into his pocket. "This is wild! Granddad said they were big, but this is huge!" Clarence wrapped a hand around the buck knife he'd used to feed it his own blood. Even if Decker hadn't disappeared, I'm pretty sure that even he couldn't have grown something this big. Reggie had his back to him, and he didn't see the knife slide out. "What have you been feeding this thing? Granddad said it took a sacrifice, but you must have spent a lot of time out here." He was so lost in his own ramblings, he didn't hear the metallic click as the knife came open. "Unless you've been making actual sacrifices out here in the east field," he said jokingly. "What's your secret, buddy? Virgin blood? Goat's blood? A little full moon?" He stopped talking when the knife slipped into the side of his neck, stopped talking, and started gurgling. The ground accepted him, and when his wife got home from her friend's house, the pumpkin was 12 feet tall. A week later, the judges came to Clarence's house to see Fritz the behemoth. Clarence won the contest, hands down. It wasn't even a contest. The judges couldn't find a pumpkin even half as large as this, and when Mrs. Clarence came for her yearly sacrifice for the pie contest, he gave her the other 3 instead. She seemed disappointed. Perhaps she had noticed what a mania this pumpkin had become for her husband, but she took them anyway, and won the pie contest that year with the tastiest pie the judges had ever had. As she left the field, her arms laden with pumpkins, Clarence first heard the slithery voice of the serpent as it offered its apple. The voice was autumn wind and winter promises, but he had heard it before, hadn't he? It was the voice that tells the farmer he can squeeze one more crop before the winter. The voice that tells the prideful that it won't be that cold tonight, so there's no need to bring the livestock in. It's the voice of creeping winter that hungers for its sacrifice. The voice told Clarence that if it gave the field his wife, his fame would be eternal. On that day, Clarence turned away from it. On that day, he was strong. The sounds of laughing children and swaying scarecrows filled the air as the plastic flags snapped in the breeze. The annual pumpkin patch was something that Clarence looked forward to with great anticipation. and this year he had a prize-winning pumpkin to display amongst the others. He had always played second fiddle to David Decker and his pumpkin patch, but this year, Clarence was the star of the show. It appeared there was a new local celebrity, though Clarence suspected that it was the gargantuan that sat behind the little fence in the patch that people had come to see. Clarence had arrayed the smaller pumpkins for sale, and even Hercules sat amongst them since he'd been spared the pie. The people milled about the patch, looking in awe at Fritz the behemoth as they made their choices. Clarence was at the card table where they sat the cash box, his wife playing the dutiful hostess out in the fields. From his vantage point behind the table, Clarence saw the kid when he stepped a little too close to the massive pumpkin. He wanted to say something to him, tell the kid to back up, but he hesitated as he watched him waddle closer. Look at the kid. He was a porker. He was a hefty kid from a family of hefty adults, and he had stopped to stare at the pumpkin as he held one of his smaller cousins in his pudgy hand. All at once, he shifted the pumpkin under his arm and stepped towards the monstrous gourd with a hand outstretched to touch. Clarence wanted to say something, should have stopped the kid before he could get any closer, but as Clarence started to raise his voice to warn him, he heard the voice of the serpent again, asking him to stand aside, commanding him to stand aside. The mustached man cleared his throat at Clarence, and Clarence sat back down. He reached for the man's money, his eyes straying to the boy as he laid one fat pink starfish hand against the red skin of the monster. He cast his eyes away, but even that didn't save him from witnessing the end. The kid went into the ground without a sound, and when the pumpkin shattered on the ground next to the gargantuan one, no one was the wiser. The police were called when the absence was noticed, and they searched the field and the forest beyond for weeks without finding a thing. The boy's parents sat at the kitchen table, his mother crying into a square of silk as Clarence's wife poured tea and assured her he'd turn up. She had kept right on assuring her of that until 10 o'clock that night. Clarence was lucky his wife was such a hostess, because all he could do was sit, shell-shocked in a chair, as she puttered around and made small talk. Everyone thought he was broken up about the kid, and in a way, they were right. After all, it's not every day you watch a kid get pulled into the soil while no one's looking. Clarence saw the flashlight lights from the inside of the tent as the fair raged outside. They had given him his own circus tent to draw in the crowd, and Clarence had no lack of people wanting to see the pumpkin. It wasn't every day you got to see a 20-foot-tall pumpkin, and he'd been making the circuit for the better part of 4 months. People were always amazed that the pumpkin stayed so fresh, so alive, but Clarence knew the reason. The best fertilizer always seemed to walk through the flap of his tent, didn't it? He won the contest the year after the kid had disappeared, too. People said he had a knack for growing pumpkins, but really, it was the same one. When it got 18 feet tall and 12 feet wide, it started to attract tourists from some of the local hollers. Some of them never made it back to wherever they had been from either, but the wrecker never asked too many questions when they came to tow their cars. By that point, Clarence was numb to the sacrifice. The pumpkin ate, the pumpkin grew, and as the tourists began to pay to see it, Clarence found that he didn't have to be a farmer anymore. The pumpkin made his farm a natural spot for tourists on the road, and they never grumbled too much about a few dollars here and there to see it. That was how he came to be on the road and in this tent. The man in the suit had offered him a startling amount of money if he'd go on the road with his gourd, and Clarence knew he'd be a fool if he didn't take him up on it. They loaded it up on a flatbed and took it to the county fair after county fair so the whole state could see the world's biggest pumpkin. They did it for 5 years, and in those 5 years, Clarence remembered hearing about a suspected serial killer plaguing the state. They dubbed him the County Fair Kidnapper, and in 5 years he abducted more than 20 children and 5 adults from state fairs across the state. The state police even questioned Clarence, though not as a suspect. They wanted to see if he'd seen anything amiss, and he always told them no. He hardly had a choice, after all. If he'd suddenly told them that his prize-winning pumpkin was eating people at an alarming rate, they'd have slapped him in the loony bin. Clarence knew he wasn't blameless in the whole affair, but the pumpkin was good for his family. The pumpkin was good for the town, after all. In truth, The massive pumpkin in Clarence's east field was the only thing that kept the town from being just another cow-flop Midwestern nothing. The pumpkin brought in the crowds, and the crowds stopped in at the cafe to have a bite. They stopped at the gas station for gas and road snacks. They stopped at the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. They spread their money up and down the street from May till November, and the town always had a corn maze or a fair to draw some of it away from the pumpkin and back into the town proper. At one point, Clarence's face and a picture of the pumpkin were even on the town sign when you drove over the city limits. "Come see the world's biggest pumpkin," it stated, in bold black letters, and at one point, you could damn near see the thing from the city outskirts. In its heyday, it towered nearly 30 feet high and was wider than the farmhouse. By this time, Clarence was blind to its feedings for the most part. Hell, by this point, Clarence was complicit in the murders. He had killed 2 for Fritz already, and was responsible for all the rest as far as he was concerned. He had turned aside, hadn't he? He was content to sit in his lawn chair by the fence and charge people for the opportunity to stand at the base of the giant and feel small in the shadow of a pumpkin. Unfortunately, Clarence had made the same mistake that many men in his position make. He had lived in the shadow of the dragon for so long that he believed he was safe, that his family was safe. It depended on him, after all, and he believed that he and his family were safe from that slithering grasp. Even after 5 years, he didn't really grasp its slyness, its cunning, until it finally took someone that he couldn't turn away from. It happened suddenly, but the horror of it would never leave him, no matter how long he lived. He was standing in the back door, watching her work in the garden. He was trying to ignore the creeping voice as it told him it needed to feed. She was out in the field, tending some vegetables in the space he no longer used, and as he watched her, he began to wonder if he might resist this evil and win free. Clarence had been this pumpkin's puppet for nearly 8 years. 8 long years of dragging its burden around his neck, and his heart was growing heavy with the burden of that sin. As he watched her in her purity and love, he began to think that he might escape this evil thing and be the man he once was. They could leave, just pack their things and go. They could leave this cursed earth behind them as they went out to start anew somewhere else. She'd noticed something was off, likely noticed from the start that something was off, but she was dutiful. She was obedient. She loved him more than he could ever love her. He would never have let her go near that field again if he had. She was coming in, carrying a basket of produce, and he would always remember the way she smiled when she saw him. Her face, that old young face of hers, stretched into a smile as she raised her hand to wave. Clarence had raised his hand to return her wave, had it half cocked, but it died on his wrist when she dropped into the earth. Dropped. That was the right word. She didn't sink. She wasn't pulled. It was as though a hole had opened up and swallowed her in one gulp. Her basket fell, tumbling vegetables across the dirt, and it was all the evidence that existed that she had been there at all. Clarence hitched in his breath as he stared at those rolling vegetables, the scream of rage and pain nearly ripping his throat apart as it rocketed into the world. It laughed at him as he dug up the field. Clarence dug it up in furious, crumping sweeps of the shovel, but he never found a trace of her. He stayed out there digging until well past moonrise, with only Fritz for company. She was the last sacrifice he was a part of. She was the last meat that Fritz didn't have to catch for himself. This was also the last time Clarence tried to square up with that terrible giant. It was black dark when he went inside, and it was past midnight when he stood in the shadow of the pumpkin again. He was drunk, weaving and bleary, and in his hand was a tin holder with a rag in the neck. Clarence had concocted this plan as he crawled head first into a jug of corn whiskey, and it was the best plan that he could think of. The coal oil would burn hot and bright, and when he threw it on the pumpkin, it caught immediately. He sat back and watched as the flames ate the fuel, but the pumpkin did nothing but laugh at his futile efforts. The slithering voice told him that he couldn't kill it that easy. It told him that the two were stuck together now, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. It had been wrong on that last account, or so Clarence hoped. He set up a fence after that, and never let the tourists come close again. They could pay their money, and they could observe from a distance, but no one was allowed to go into the field again. It cawed at him as Clarence sat in the chair by the fence. It said that this was a useless gesture, that it couldn't stop him if he wanted them, but he ignored it. He kept his vigil, kept his silence, and as the two lived, the town shriveled around them. It had gotten too powerful, too evil to be contained, and those who spent time close to it became susceptible to its voice. They came in the night, and they died silently in the field as they were drawn into the earth. The sheriff, the owner of the feed store, the girl who served the coffee at the diner, they all came to the field to give their lives to the gourd. Clarence tried to stop them, but no matter what he tried or how he fought, they all came to the gourd and gave it their life's blood. The town was deserted, a ghost town in a country full of ghost towns, and the only thing to see was Fritz. Fritz, the world's oldest pumpkin. They're both shriveled now, a couple of relics from a bygone age, and those who come to see them usually say how they saw Big Fritz when they were kids. Clarence still keeps his vigil, but the pumpkin's a lot more manageable now. He sits in a glass case, small and red and angry, and those who stand around looking too long always come away with headaches. For $5, you can get your selfie and have a pamphlet on the ninth wonder of the world, but the crowds have mostly gone now. He's a shriveled old thing, small as he was before Clarence gave him his first drop of blood, but if you spend too long in his company, you can hear his creaky old voice. You can start to feel his influence in your head. Spend too much time around him, and one night he might just draw you into the field and begin the cycle anew. Grandpa was born on October 30th, 1945. He and my grandma were the closest thing I had to real parents, and I'm grateful to have had them. My dad was never anything more than a name on a birth certificate, and my mom was in an accident just after I was born. I've lived with my grandparents since I was 8 months old, and I learned so much from them. Grandma taught me to take care of myself, to cook and clean, and how to be responsible for a household. From Granddad, I learned, too many things to list. He taught me to hunt, to fish, to manage my money, to pay my debts, how to be a man. As I said, that's a lot to put on a short description, but Grandpa was a great man. He shared everything with me, the two of us being incredibly close, but I recently found out that he held on to one little secret, the secret to his long life, something I learned on the day that he died. Grandpa always celebrated his birthday in the same way. He would sit on the porch with Grandma, both of them in costume, and pass out candy to trick-or-treaters. Grandpa loved Halloween, always wore a costume, and bought the best candy for the scores of kids that came to the farm. Grandpa was known for his corn mazes, spooky decorations, and the best candy in town. I've always helped with the festivities throughout my childhood, and despite all the smiling kids and happy adults, Grandpa always had the biggest grin on his face. As the porch lights started going off, and the kids started heading home, Grandma would light the candles, and we would sing to Grandpa as he sat smiling at the small pile of candles smoldering on top of his cake. In the candlelight, his face always seemed more lined and seamed than it normally did. Granddad had looked 40 well into his 60s, but he looked about 100 in the light of all those candles. After he blew them out, Grandma would cut pieces off the double chocolate cake, and Grandpa would savor every bite like it might be his last. I asked him about it once, and he just laughed and said that one day I'd understand. Then he'd check his watch, 9:55 on the dot, and he'd excuse himself to go set up in his music room. Calling it a music room doesn't really capture its grandeur. Grandpa, back in his day, was a country music star of sorts. He played on the Grand Ole Opry, joined the band with the Presley Jamboree, and he'd opened for Johnny Cash in his heyday. The room was full of pictures of him playing with everyone from Merle Haggard to Conway Twitty. and his guitar collection was awe-inspiring. Granddad spent a lot of time there, as I remember, and he often wrote songs for artists and recording companies. He would sit there on his birthday, however, and play the same old guitar every time. It was a battered old acoustic, the lacquered white body peeling and ratty, the strings worn to the point of unraveling, and the neck seemed chipped beyond repair. Despite this, it was one of Grandpa's favorites, and he picked it often when he was alone. Despite this, he always looked so thoughtful when he played, like it reminded him of something he'd rather forget. Grandpa would sit in there and practice for a little while, and then, at exactly 10:30, he would call me in, kiss my forehead, and tell me to get to bed. I would always stay up on Grandpa's birthday, even if I had school the next day. At 10:30, though, I would go to bed, and I would always listen to the music from the room as Grandpa played. When I was little, I just listened from my bed, the words making me feel weird. Granddad's voice was smooth, ageless, and I sometimes thought that it must be a younger man who was singing with Granddad. In the beginning, I did think I heard a second voice, but I always put it aside as my ears playing tricks on me. Well, what is this I can't see with ice cold hands getting hold of me? Well, I am death, none can excel. Open the door to heaven or hell. I was 6 the first time I snuck out to listen to Granddad. I was so scared, not because I was breaking the rules, but because it was so dark in the hallway. Granddad had one of those old character lamps, Woody Woodpecker, I think, and the bulb was old and yellow. It made a little island of light, a reprieve in the darkness, and I had to walk through the darkness with something like real terror creeping up my throat. I didn't want to go, not at first, but the music seemed to pull me. The closer I got to the door, the closer it all became. I could hear Grandpa's voice oozing from beneath the door, and it enticed me right up to the lock. Oh, death, oh, death, won't you spare me over to another year? I knew there was definitely a second voice singing, something low and gravelly, and it oddly harmonized with Grandpa's silky tones. That old guitar, the one with the bone-white body, jangled on the 4th key as the tuner loosened in that slow, careful way that it does. Even this didn't sound at odds with the song. It all came together like a dying body singing its final notes. Granddad played, the strangers singing harmony with him, and I leaned against the door as I listened to them. Oh, death, someone would pray, could you wait to call me just another day? The children prayed, the preacher preached, time and mercy are out of your reach. I left before the song was over, climbing into bed and covering up as Granddad finished playing and went to bed himself. I never heard his guest leave, just Grandpa sharing a few quiet words before leaving his music room and heading to bed. Even at 6, I knew that was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I was young, and my brain was involved in other matters, like Ninja Turtles and the 3rd Mario game. I guess that was when I started paying attention to Granddad's yearly ritual. I was young, so it was only precursory at best. I noticed Granddad pass out candy, run the yearly carnival, eat his cake, and then retire to his music room. After I'd gone to bed, he would play that song, his strange guest singing along, and I would sit at the door and listen. It was always the same song, the mournful tone that made my skin prickle. The voice singing with him was part of it, I realized. But I didn't know exactly what I was hearing until much later. I just assumed that he had some friend who came over late to celebrate his birthday, with some songs and maybe a few drinks. I'll fix your feet till you can't walk, lock your jaw so you can't talk. Close your eyes so you can't see this very hour. Come and go with me. The way the guitar shivered in his hand as his dexterous fingers rang the sounds from the strings was magical. I'd seen his fingers grow thicker and thicker as the arthritis took the mobility from his hands, but it never seemed to extend to his playing. On nights like tonight, though, It was like having my grandfather play in his 20s again. His nimble fingers playing on the aging guitar were ghostly, and I became more scared of the music than anything in the hallway. I have come to take your soul, leave the body and leave it cold. To drop the flesh from off the frame, earth and worms will have their claim. I was 12 when I asked him about the strange jam sessions he had. I was eating eggs and grits at the table, the school bus still an hour away, and the yawn that interrupted my eating made Grandpa chuckle as he entered the kitchen. "Stay up too late reading your funny books again?" Grandpa asked, shaking out his newspaper. He'd been awake since the sun's edges graced the sky, and his hands were already gray with soil. Granddad's father had been a farmer, just like his father before him. Granddad had kept the tradition alive, despite not needing to. Granddad hadn't been foolish with his money like some of his contemporaries had been. He had bought land, invested in things that lasted, and now in his old age, he rested on his laurels. "Nah," I said, deciding to ask the question that had been bugging me for years. "I guess I heard you playing last night and just couldn't get to sleep." Grandpa hummed from behind his paper, but I could tell that the question was something he was considering. It was November 1st, and Grandpa had gone through his usual routine last night, complete with jam session. I had lingered outside the door, my hand on the knob as I listened, and I had only just slipped back in my room when he came out. The whole time he played, I had thought about just throwing the door open and seeing who was singing with him, but the idea seemed tantamount to walking in on Gramps while he was in the shower. Plus, hell, there was something about the person singing with him that scared me a little. I couldn't put my finger on it, but that was not a man to be crept up on. "Who do you play with every year, Gramps?" I asked, keeping eye contact with the back of his paper as he hid behind it. "I never see them leave, but I know I've heard them." Grandpa was quiet for a little while, long enough for me to think that he wouldn't answer. "It's an old friend, kiddo." I took a few more bites as I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Grandma put some breakfast down in front of him, and Grandpa folded his paper and began to eat. I watched the eggs and bacon being forked into his mouth, giving him a moment before plunging onward. Grandpa didn't like being prodded, especially when he was eating, but I needed some answers. "So who are they? I've never seen them come in, or even leave after." "You don't need to know. It's none of your business, kiddo, so don't be nosy." My curiosity was piqued, but Grandpa had made it pretty clear that the subject was closed. It wouldn't do any good to argue once his mind was made up either, but that wouldn't stop me from continuing my investigation. I asked Grandma about it, but she wouldn't tell me much either. "It's something your grandpa's done since he was young. He told me after we were married that it was something he had to do once a year and that I couldn't bother him while he was doing it. The consequences would be dire," is all he would say when I asked him why. When I asked her why he did it at night, she told me that Grandpa had said that he was born at night. He was born at 10:46 on Halloween. He says that has something to do with it, but he's never told me more than that, and I've never asked. Your grandfather is a heck of a man, but business is business. You might not like what you find if you go poking around either, kiddo. I didn't fully understand at 12, but it made me hungry to know more. "Oh, death, whoa, death, won't you spare me over till another year?" I spent the next 10 years crouching outside the door, listening to the song. I'd learned the song. It was an old one, and Grandpa played it better than anyone I'd ever heard. Grandpa played it as though he was busking to buy daily bread. He put his heart and soul into every word, which somehow changed the words. It was something I looked forward to every year, and part of the reason I asked Grandpa to teach me how to play in the first place. "My mother came to my bed, placed a cold towel upon my head. My head is warm, my feet are cold, death's a-moving upon my soul." Grandpa was thrilled when I asked him to teach me. I was 13 and I wanted to know how to make music like him. He told me not to get too ahead of myself, but agreed to teach me after school. He was pretty clear that my schooling had to come first, but he was more than happy to teach me the chords and some techniques. We practiced after school every day, Grandpa taking me through the basics with ease. I took to it pretty quick. Grandpa saying I must have gotten the knack from him, and pretty soon I was playing the usual teenage standbys. Grandpa rolled his eyes as I played Wonderwall and Chop Suey, playing along as I powered through Bridge Over Troubled Waters or House of the Rising Sun. Grandpa taught me some of the old shit-kicking tunes he used to cut his teeth on at the honky-tonks, and soon I was playing along with most of what he threw at me. It wasn't until I picked at the first few chords to the song I'd heard him play on his birthday that he covered my hand and stopped me. "Not that song, kid. Never play that song. That song is... I only play that song once a year, and never until then. Oh, death, how you treating me. Closed my eyes so I can't see. Well, you're hurting my body, you make me cold. You run my life right out of my soul." Grandpa and I played every chance we got, and as the years proceeded, I found I liked playing music with him. I always played for fun, though. I never made it more than something to impress girls at a bonfire, or wow my friends at the talent show. By 16, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Music was fun, but I loved discovering how things worked. Machines were my passion, but I loved taking anything apart and discovering how it functioned. Granddad supported my plans to go to college after high school, and for graduation, he presented me with a beautiful acoustic guitar. So you don't forget to have fun while you're working your ass off, kiddo. Oh, death, consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage. My wealth is all at your command. If only you'll move your ice-cold hand. Tonight, Grandpa celebrated his 75th birthday in the same way he always did. He dressed as Old MacDonald, Grandma as Mrs. MacDonald, in a long flowery dress, and they handed out candy to cowboys and aliens and various superheroes. I've been living with them while I attend college, and as the kids left and the floodlights went out for the night, I slid the comically large cow head off and joined my grandparents on the porch. Grandma had a double chocolate cake, alight with 75 burning candles. As we ate our cake, I couldn't help but notice that Grandpa looked a little different tonight. Not sad, but speculative. Like this might be the last piece of Grandma's cake he ever ate. When I got up to take my plate to the kitchen, Grandpa put a hand on my arm and asked Grandma if she would mind taking my plate too. She said not a bit, and took all 3 plates to the kitchen so she could wash up. Grandpa looked at me, his face asking the question before his mouth, and it was the question I'd been waiting to hear my whole life. "Would you like to come and play with me tonight?" I was speechless. How long had I waited for just that very thing? I nodded at him and followed him to the music room with excitement and apprehension. I was finally going to get to meet Grandpa's mysterious guest, the one I'd heard singing for so many years. I remembered the way that touching the doorknob had made me feel, and wondered if I could even play in his presence. "Oh, the young, the rich, the poor, all alike to me you know. No wealth, no land, silver or gold, nothing satisfies but your soul." He was waiting for us when we came into the studio. He was, well, there was no way to describe him. He was tall, not height-wise, but more long than tall, I guess. His fingers were especially long, and I wondered if he played guitar too. He was dressed in white, his pristine suit complete with a bolo tie, and his hat was a tall 10-gallon that made him look like a rancher on a western. His face gave me the willies, though. He looked like someone had stretched a very believable flesh mask over a cow skull. The bones in his cheeks poked out oddly. His ears were long and curved in strange ways. His eyes were hollow, like a skull, and looking at him made me a little ill. Who was this guy? How did he know my granddad? He must be important if Granddad would spend his birthday evening with him every year.
"Ah, Ramon, good to see you."
"Azzy," Granddad said, taking his guitar off the wall. "Long time no see."
365 days to be exact. So you play for me tonight?
Grandpa looked at the guitar, the bone-white body looking odd against his tan skin, and smiled as he walked towards me. "Nope, my grandson is." He pushed the guitar into my hand and took a seat beside me. The guitar felt strange, like nothing I'd ever held before. The neck felt porous, almost like driftwood, and the body was coarse against my skin. There was a smell to it, something like moldy wood, and I realized I had never actually played this guitar before. Grandpa played it sometimes, but other than the nights like this, he didn't seem to want to touch it. The stranger looked at me expectantly, and as I strummed the chords, I could only think of one song I wanted to play. The song I had heard so many times spilling out from under that door, spilled from my own mouth like he had gutted me. The words bubbled out as I sang for death's reprieve, for death's abatement, and as I sang, I felt the stranger watching me. Though my call was to death, it felt as if this stranger were the one I was truly singing to. I felt like his eyes were boring into me, seeing my worth, and as the song came to a close, he clapped his hands together in mock good cheer. His hands coming together sounded like bones rattling in a crypt.
Well done, kid. You got chops. Maybe not chops as big as your grandpa here, but chops. Take it this means our deal's at an end, Ramon?
Granddad nodded, reaching for the guitar and nodding to me. Head to bed, kid. Azzy and I have some business to discuss. I told him I'd see him tomorrow, but I doubted him when he said he was sure he would. I wept as I lay in bed, not knowing why. Grandma woke me up the next morning. She was crying, her words slurred as she told me that Grandpa was in his music room. He had passed in the chair that he always sat in when he played music. The doctors said it had been a heart attack, that he likely hadn't suffered. I hadn't needed him to tell me that. When I came across Grandpa in his music room, he had the most satisfied smile on his face. That white guitar was laying across his lap, and when I picked it up, I put it away, the touch of it making my skin crawl. I was kind of numb through the funeral, unable to come to terms with what I'd seen. Had that man, the one that Grandpa had called Azzy, been responsible for his death? How had he given Grandpa a heart attack? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, but I felt like he had something to do with all of this. Grandpa's note, however, brought it all into perspective. Grandpa left me his music room and his will. All the guitars were mine, all the awards, all the music memorabilia, a binder of songs that he hadn't sold yet. It was a generous gift, given on the grounds that I stay in school and help Grandma keep the house up. The house would be mine after Grandma was gone, but I hoped that would be many years away. I found myself there after the funeral, as my eyes strayed to that strange guitar again, and I wondered how I had missed the note. It was slid under the strings on the neck, and the white paper stood out like a surrender flag. I picked it up, trying not to touch the guitar, and unfolded it to see Grandpa's neat handwriting. If you're reading this, kid, then I'm gone. The music room's yours, and I hope you'll take good care of the things in it as I did. I've had a long and happy life, kiddo, and it was made better by watching you grow into a fine man. You'll make a fantastic engineer one day, but for now, I want to talk about the music. I've been playing and singing since I could walk, but it wasn't until Azzy saw me at the Bent Spoon one night that I really got my break. I saw him watching me as I played. How could you miss him, even in a crowd? The longer he watched, the more intent on me he became, and after I was finished, he approached me with an offer. He gave me that guitar, the strange one that I sometimes play, the one that feels like rotten wood, and told me to play. He said as long as I played music with it, I'd be successful, have the kind of money that I could only dream of, and have a long and fruitful life. The trade-off, though, was twofold. Once a year at the time of my birth, I would play that song for him. If I missed a year, then the deal was off, and my life would end. The other part was that, after my death, I would come to his world and play for him for all time. You're a smart kid, like I was a smart kid. You likely realize that Azzy, Azrael to everyone but me, ain't human. If you take up that guitar and play for him, you can live as I lived. You can be a star. You can live comfortably. But you'll be with him when it's all said and done. I regretted my decisions at leisure, having acted in haste in my youth. but I felt it was time to make good on my deal. I know that when I die, I won't sit at the right hand of God, as it says in those songs I've sung sometimes. I don't know what awaits me, but 75 years is a long time to walk the skin of the earth. I'm tired, kiddo. It seems like a good time to lay my burdens down. I don't know where I'm going, but I hope I don't see you there someday. Tell Melinda I love her, and watch over her until God calls her home. I won't tell you not to take up the guitar, but if you do, I feel like you should know the consequences. I love you, kiddo. Have a great life. Love, Grandpa. That was 5 years ago. Grandma passed away before I graduated college, but I became the engineer that I always wanted to be. I've got a great job. I'm seeing an amazing woman that I mean to propose to next month. And I've made my grandpa's home my own. I still sit in my grandpa's music room sometimes, though, strum a few chords or play something we played together. The white guitar hasn't moved since I put it on the wall the day that Grandpa died, and I don't intend to ever take it down again. Sometimes, though, I get the itch to pick it up and play it, especially on my birthday at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think it or its owner will be content with Wonderwall or House of the Rising Sun, though. No, I think it wants something older, something blacker, and I think the bargain will be for something harder to pin down than time or wealth. I may not want to, but I fear that someday I'll take up Grandpa's guitar, and the bargain will be the same as it was for him so many years ago. I fear that one day I'll trade my soul to death so he might spare me over till another year. Doubtless, our stories were what brought him in. This was the first Halloween after our town lifted the COVID restrictions, and most of us were taking advantage of it. My friends and I were probably a little too old to trick-or-treat, but it really didn't matter to us. We made some last-minute costumes and went out to join the kids, though I don't think any of them were fooled. We were 13, nearly ready for high school, but they filled our pillowcases nonetheless. Rich was some kind of cowboy, Hank a car crash victim with some red paint and a little makeup, and I had thrown on a long coat from my older sister's costume trunk and some fake vampire teeth to make me look particularly ghoulish. The three of us had hit the streets after that. The candy was secondary anyway, and we all knew it. Halloween fell on a Friday this year, you see. That meant that we could go eat our candy at the fire pit once we were done, and our parents probably wouldn't expect us home till late. The fire pit was a common spot for us to go to when the weather was good. We would light a fire and tell ghost stories around it, usually roasting marshmallows or hot dogs to go along with the tales. It was something we looked forward to, and it wasn't something we'd got to do in a while. So, with our parents' blessing, we put our pillowcases over our shoulders and stalked off into the woods that surrounded the cul-de-sac where we all lived. The rain had been light that year, and after collecting up some branches and getting a fire going, we set about starting our stories as the round Halloween moon hung overhead. Rich had just begun a story about a group of kids camping in the woods on Halloween when he suddenly stopped and squinted into the trees. "What?" asked Hank, clearly smelling mischief as he tossed the stick off of his blow-pop into the fire. "Could have sworn I saw something," Rich said, "like fairy fire or something." I turned to look, thinking he was building tension for his story, when I saw it too. It was like dancing candles, the shapes bouncing and jouncing in the dark, and the closer it came, the easier it was to recognize. It was too cohesive to be fireflies, and too consistent to be anything but what it was. The closer it came, the more I could make out the familiar shape of a jack-o'-lantern, though the realization did little to put me at ease. Unless it was being carried by a ghost, then someone had to be holding it, and the idea of some random person wandering in the woods at night was a little off-putting all on its own. The owner of the pumpkin turned out to be an old tramp who smelled as if he'd been bathed in cheap liquor. He came swaying out of the woods, singing a slurry song as he came, and we all hunched a little as we hoped he would pass us by. The call of the fire turned out to be a little too much for him, though, and I caught the last refrains of his song as he crunched into the clearing. Well, stingy Jack was turned away, for nary heaven or hell did want him, but Satan lit a friendly face, so a smile would go afore him. He sang out the last line as he came to the fire, plopping down on a log as if it had been left there for him. He was dressed in shabby cast-off clothes, the pants cuffs full of cockleburrs and the shirt covered in stains. His burnt orange hair had grown into his beard, and it was hard to see much of his face through the tangle. He set the jack-o'-lantern on his lap, the gourd having a handle through it, and nodded at the three of us as we stared mistrustfully at him. A fine evening to y'all. Dunna mean to startle ya. I'd thought for sure your fire might be unoccupied. But I see I was mistaken. You wouldn't mind sharing a tale or two with old Jackie now, would ya? His accent was very thick, thicker than I'd ever heard in my whole life, and the three of us just stared at each other before shrugging. There didn't seem to be any harm in the old fella, and maybe he had a tale or two to tell us as well. It was kind of novel to have someone else who might tell a story, and we told him he was welcome to listen, if he wanted. I think, even then, I might have started to put two and two together, but it was just an inkling at first, something about the song and the pumpkin he carried. Rich continued his story about the three kids camping on Halloween, and how the mysterious whistler who tormented them had finally driven them crazy. Rich even whistled a little in a few parts, and we were all pretty spooked by the end. I cast a glance at our stowaway, but he just sat placidly on his stump, with his beetle-black eyes twinkling in the tangle of his beard, and his pumpkin winking in the slight breeze. A fine story, he said, looking across the fire at the rest of us. Anyone else got a good tale? Nothing I like more on Halloween than a good yarn. Hank tossed a Jolly Rancher into his mouth, and around the slight lisp of the dissolving candy against his cheek, he told a story about a kid who hated jack-o'-lanterns. As Hank's story went on, I found my eyes glued to the old fella as his smiling eyes took a distinctly downward cast. He clutched his pumpkin tightly as Hank talked about how the boys had smashed them, all in the service of the Green Man, and he didn't seem to care for that much. I suddenly wondered how long he'd been toting that pumpkin, and whether it was an actual gourd or some kind of prop. His bearded face twitched when Hank mentioned the Green Man, and began to wonder if it was a legend he was aware of. Rich did a little golf clap as Hank finished, and the old vag was still clutching at his pumpkin like he might try to steal it. This Green Man, have you ever seen him round these parts? Hank laughed. Of course not, sir. It's just a story. Nobody really believes in the Green Man. It's just a legend we tell to scare each other. The old man nodded at Hank, but to me it looked condescending. It was the same look that little kids give you when you try to tell them there was no Santa Claus. It's a look that says, sure, that's what you say, but we all know better, don't we? He loosened his grip on his gourd, turning to me as if asking if I had a story for him too. I guess I do, I said, though it's not a very scary story. Psh, Rich said. Then what kind of story is it? We all told spooky ones, so this one better be something awesome if it isn't scary. The old man was looking at me with interest, as if he knew exactly what I might tell, and I was excited to hear it. It's an old story my gran told me when I was little. She used to tell it to me while we were carving pumpkins, and it's supposed to be from the old times. It's about a man named Stingy Jack and how he's the reason for jack-o'-lanterns. Rich rolled his eyes, but one look at the old fella showed me that I had his undivided attention. It's also about how he tricked the devil not once, but twice. That had his attention, and Rich leaned back as he looked over, nodding for me to continue. The old man was nodding too, and I smiled as I started my story. Stingy Jack was supposed to be one of the most skinflint drunks in the village he lived in. He never bought new clothes, he didn't take care of his property, and he was a sot drunk every day, including Sunday. He was not held in high regard by the townspeople, but as little as they liked him, none could argue that Jack was clever. He never wanted for whiskey or money, and his deals and bets often set him against the townspeople. It was widely believed that one day he would come to a sticky end, and one day his reputation caught up with him. You see, the devil had heard about his cleverness and how his trickery might rival even his own. So he came to Earth to try and weasel the old drunk out of his soul so he could claim his cleverness for his own. Jack was sleeping beneath an old tree when the devil appeared before him, and even half asleep, he was formidable. He begged the devil to grant him one last request before he took him to the underworld, and when the old imp asked him what it was, he said he wanted one last drink at the local tavern. My friends were listening, but it was more out of polite interest. The story had no monsters or murderers or any of the usual scary story fare, and they were getting a little bored with my grandma's Irish folk tales. They, however, were not the one I'd been targeting with my story. The old man was leaning forward on his log and was close enough that I was worried he might catch his beard on fire. Well, one drink became two became too many, and soon the devil was well and truly drunk. So when Jack passed him the bill, the devil was confused. What use do denizens of hell have for money, he asked, the barman standing back in fear as the old demon raged. Jack, however, had an answer. Why not turn yourself into a gold piece? Then we can be paying this old fool, and you can be taking me onto the fiery underworld. So the devil did just that. He turned himself into a fat gold piece, but before the barman could scoop it up, Jack had popped it into his own pocket, right next to his mother's rosary. The devil writhed and begged, wanting to be free of this prison, but Jack told him that he wouldn't let him go unless he promised to spare his soul for another 10 years. The devil accepted this deal, and Jack took the coin and tossed it as far from him as he could. The devil had been bested, but he didn't fret. What was 10 years to him, after all? He could wait on Jack's soul a little longer, and he returned to hell to wait for the deal to be over. I didn't bother to look at my friends, but I had eyes only for the strange man. He was the best audience I'd ever had, looking intently at me as Gran's tale unwound like old soft yarn. So, 10 years went by, and the devil returned to once again collect Jack's soul. He found him sleeping beneath the same tree, having aged not a day from the last time he'd seen him. He told Jack that today he would repay his debt, but 10 years had done nothing to dull Jack's cleverness. He begged the devil once again for a single boon before he took him to hell, an apple from the tastiest tree for his final meal. Well, Satan was hesitant, to say the least, but he would find no trap there. So he climbed the tree to get the apple. It was late season, however, and the only remaining apple was at the very top. As he climbed up the thick old branches, this gave Jack plenty of time to carve a cross at the bottom of the tree, trapping him in the boughs. The devil cursed and railed at the man, begged and pleaded, and finally offered him riches beyond measure. Jack, however, only wanted one thing. I paused, letting the suspense draw out a little, though I suspected it was just the haggard old man. He wanted to never again be bothered by the fallen angel or any of his ilk, and to never be in danger of his soul going to hell again. The devil again railed and threatened, begged and pleaded, but in the end, he surrendered and gave the old man what he wanted. He went back to hell the loser in yet another exchange, but Jack's victory and his luck was not to last. The old man sat back a little, clearly not looking forward to the rest of the story. He liked tales of cleverness all well and good, but it appeared this part might be a sore subject for him. I suspected even more now that I knew what had brought him to our fire, and it was something else that Gran had told me on the porch when I was just a tyke. He was not a young man, and when he died of natural causes not long after, there was the question of where he would go. He could not go to heaven, for he had not lived a godly life. But he could not go to hell either, because of the deal he had made. So Jack was forced to walk the earth, but the devil gave him something to remember him by. He gifted him a coal of hellfire and a gourd to carry it in. So stingy Jack walks the earth for all time with that gourd to light his way, and the face it carries has become the pumpkin that we all carve to ward away the devil should he come to our homes some Halloween night. There was silence after the story ended, and the wind rustled the leaves as we all sat watching the homeless man. He sat like a statue, grinning behind his beard as the pumpkin flickered ghoulishly. Were the flames a little bit green? They might have been, but I couldn't be sure. The leaves made a skeletal sound in the wind, and as the knot popped in the fire, it brought us all back to our senses. "Not a real scary story," Rich said, "but it was interesting. How about you, sir? You got any stories you'd—" But he stopped as he looked dumbfounded at the place where the old man had been not a moment before. The log was empty, save for a pumpkin sitting on it. I kept that pumpkin, taking it home and keeping it well past the Halloween season. It burns in my windowsill now, the ghostly glow casting long shadows up my wall. I don't know why I told that story. It was one I hadn't thought of in years, but it seemed fitting. Somehow, and I don't know how, I think I knew who it was that sat by my fire that night and decided to remind him that there are people who remembered him. My gran certainly did, often telling the story when I was young, and Stingy Jack was one of her favorite stories to tell us as we gathered around the fire for a tale. She always told us that if we should see him around our fires, that it was best to flatter creatures of the hereafter so they didn't haunt us for too long. Watching the ghostly flames dance on the wall as I write this, I guess he was pleased.